So my name is Vince Tucker. I'm Director of Men's Accountability at Veronica's Voice, and we are working in partnership with Peter Qualentine to replicate his model in Kansas City here for an offender reeducation program. We chose Peter because he has a history and a philosophy of supporting survivor-led organizations, and he has a philosophy that's real similar to ours with regards to addressing men's accountability, understanding the cultural issues, and how to educate men and teach them healthier masculinity, which may some of those thought patterns contribute to their decisions to buy. So we really like his language and how he speaks, and it really resonates with what we do here at Veronica's Voice. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Peter and let him formally introduce himself and give you his presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Vince and Lucy, for having me here to this webinar today. And I really am thrilled to be doing this and thrilled to be working with Veronica's Voice and working with a bunch of cities around the country on similar sorts of issues and on developing ways, practices, policies of holding men accountable for the harm of commercial sexual exploitation. But it's always great when I get to work with a survivor-led exit program for adults, because I think that that's really fundamentally where we need to look to in terms of who we're going to be accountable to, right? We need to be accountable to those who are actually harmed by systems of commercial sexual exploitation. And so I'm going to share my screen. Everybody see that? Great.
Yes, it's up.
Perfect. And so what I'm going to be talking with you about today is promoting men's accountability to end commercial sexual exploitation. And the reason that I think it's important to address these issues from this perspective is because so often when we think of commercial sexual exploitation, we think of the person who's been harmed, of course, right? That's the person who we want to be working for. And that's why we want to end commercial sexual exploitation. But I think that we need to be able to expand our analysis and really take a look at how these things work as systems and the role that men specifically play in driving those systems. And I've been, working actively on these issues for a long time, for about 30 years. And I got started actually working on trying to engage men to end domestic violence. I wasn't even concerned with commercial sexual exploitation when I got started. And a large part of why I got interested in doing this work is because I grew up in a domestic violence household. And because I saw pretty early on that although my father's violence became a problem for my mom and my siblings and me, that it was really his problem, right? His lack of ability to deal with criticism, frustration, disappointment, his feelings of entitlement to take out things sideways on the people around him, on the people who loved him and on the people who he loved. And as I got older, I saw this wasn't just happening in my house, but it was happening in many houses. And when it was happening, it was primarily men's violence. And so men, I saw, had a special role in working to end it. Because, like I said, domestic violence, sexual assault, commercial sexual exploitation are men's problems. They're often considered women's problems, but they become women's problems. The fundamental problem is in the hearts of men. And so I think pulling that analysis from from domestic violence and applying it to commercial sexual exploitation is really what I've been doing in my career for the past 3 decades. And most recently in Seattle, where we had quite a bit of success. And so what I'm going to be sharing with you today is a little bit about that Seattle model that we developed in terms of how do we promote men's accountability to end commercial sexual exploitation, and some ideas about what could move things forward for you all in your location. And so with that, I'll get started with my slides. And the first thing I always like to say is that the problem with prostitution is not that it involves sex. Primary problem with prostitution and other forms of commercial sexual exploitation is the harm that's experienced by people who are exploited. And I used to open up by talking about the worst, most horrific types of harm because they happen. They happen to people in prostitution all the time. But one of the things I think that happens when we just talk about the most overt forms of violence is that we miss out on the fact that all of the things that happen in commercial sexual exploitation promote things like you see on the screen. And this was a research project that was done that looked at folks in and out of the life of prostitution. And what they found was the rates of depression, anxiety, nightmares, flashbacks, self-esteem, shame, PTSD, and suicide attempts were just off the charts. So we don't even really need to look at who among these folks experienced the most horrific forms of harm, and I assure you many of them did. But just the act of prostitution itself, regardless of where it fits on a continuum of violence, promotes these sorts of responses in people who have been in these systems. And so this is what the harm that we're trying to address. This is what we're trying to get to. And this harm is done by men who buy sex, and I say men because regardless of the gender of the person who's bought, regardless if the person who is being exploited is a woman or a boy or a man or a transgender person, the buyer is almost always a man. And so that is why when I'm talking about men who buy sex, I'm talking about men who buy sex, because there's enough exceptions to prove the rule, but generally most women don't buy sex. The vast majority of sex buyers are men. And it's not just the sex buyers acting out on people in prostitution. And I think this is important to note, is that buying sex is also associated with other forms of men's perpetration of gender-based violence, including physical and sexual violence against intimate partners, including perpetration of rape against people they're partnered to and not. And generally committing more sexually coercive behaviors than men who have not used women in prostitution. And this is international, cross-cultural. Like, men who buy sex are more likely to do these other forms of harm, other forms of violence. And it makes sense to me, if you are able to objectify and dehumanize somebody to the point where you're able to treat them like an object in this way, it makes sense to me that that wouldn't stop with just somebody who's being exploited, but would extend to other people in their lives. I think this is important for that reason. It's also important because I think one of the things I hear a lot from men and some women too is that, well, we need to have prostitution because if you didn't have prostitution, then somehow rape rates would go up, that there's this catharsis that happens where prostitution prevents people from being raped, people not in prostitution. And what I think we've seen with the data is that that's just not true. That if somebody feels entitled to act out sexually in this way, that they're going to be feel entitled to act out sexually in other ways. Okay, so we know about the harm to people who have been exploited. We know about the harm to women as a class, right? To those women in the lives of men who buy sex who maybe aren't in prostitution, that there's potential harm there. And so we know that aspect of things. We know that most people in prostitution want to leave. One of the things we don't often know and don't often think about is that the vast majority of men who buy sex say they want to stop. And this is something we've been looking at for the past half a decade or so. And in survey after survey, most recently in this 2019 survey, for 64% of men who buy sex agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, I want to stop buying sex. And so this is important in that it tells us that this is a behavior that we really can get some leverage on to change, because it's something that they want to change. There's great ambivalence among sex buyers. And since that ambivalence exists, it's possible to engage them in trying to change that behavior. The other point it leads to is, okay, so if we know most men want to stop buying sex that are buying sex, why are they doing it? Why don't they just stop? And so I think that we need to really interrogate that question in order to wrap our heads around what the problem is and how do we promote men's accountability to end it. And so a lot of people want to go to, oh, it's a compulsion or an addiction. And I would caution about going down that road. For some, it can be a compulsive act. It can be an addictive behavior. But that doesn't mean necessarily that we can just chalk it up to only addiction. A good friend of mine who's a sex addiction therapist says about 1 in 6 men that buy sex would qualify for a compulsion or addiction, right? But sex addicts behave in other ways as well, not just acting out on people in prostitution. And so I think there's a really specific subset of folks who have sex addiction that buy sex, but we can look at them more broadly as sex buyers, because even those that are addiction are choosing to act out in this particular way with this particular population. And that's largely rooted in the fact that they feel entitled to do so. And so I think sticking with that kind of like entitlement an understanding of men's entitlement is a good way to start understanding why men buy sex. The other thing that I think is essential to look at is that gender. And what we can hear from the men themselves. Here's a couple men who have been through the sex buyers class I did in Seattle, the 10-week sex buyers intervention class called Stopping Sexual Exploitation. So here's one guy, when we asked him why he bought sex, said, "I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection." Right? The only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection. I can buy sex, not worry about being rejected, and not have to be intimate, not have to treat this other person like a person. Another guy said the same thing in a different way. He said, "I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women." Love sex, but I hate women. And this one was even shocking for me. When I heard him say this, I had to ask him again. I said, "What do you mean you love sex because you buy sex because you love sex, but you hate women?" And he went on to say, "Oh, well, I hate women because I was married to one of them for 15 years. And then she left me and took half of everything I had." And my response to him was, "Oh, so you're hurt and you feel betrayed and you have no skills and no abilities to work your way through that grief. And so instead of actually dealing with your feelings and dealing with your issues, you're going to project them onto half of the human population and not ever make yourself vulnerable again." And so you can see the connection there. I buy sex because the only thing I'm afraid of than intimacy is rejection. I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women. These things are really intrinsically tied. And they're tied to the social construction of gender. They're tied to what we learn when we're growing up about what it means to be a man in the world and what it means to be, how we treat women, how we treat the girls and women in our lives. And this behavior is something that we learn really early on, right? That we learn about this, about gender from the time we're born. And for boys, we get the message early and often, we need to act like a man. We need to be tough. We need to be non-emotional. We need to always be dominant. We need to be in charge. There's a lot of messaging that we get specifically around sex about how we're supposed to be as men. And it sets up this mythology that as men, we get challenged to live up to. In fact, no man can meet those manhood standards all the time, and very few of us can any of the time. But a lot of men spend a great deal of time and energy pretending that we live up to them and trying to prove to our friends and ourselves and girls, because we think that they're going to like us more if we kind of fit into this man box. And that man box is something that I think that, there are great things in it. I'm not saying it's great to be strong. It's great to be a leader. It's great to, to be resilient, all of those things are fantastic. Part of the problem with the man box is the things that aren't in it. Things like the ability to be compassionate, empathetic, to love and be loved, to fail, to be resilient with our failure, to be able to move through our shame, to be able to grieve, to be able to have a full range of feelings, and be able to connect with people about them. Those are the things that are missing from the man training. And it leads to what Thoreau talked about in a way that really has always been appealing to me. It's a quote from him. He said, "Most men lead lives of quiet desperation and go to the grave with the song still in them." And I think for me, if I look at my dad and my grandfather and lots of men that I've known in my lives, that they've never really gotten to step into their full, authentic sense of their self or who they are in the world. They've been really limited because of their adherence to these rigid ideas about what it means to be a man. So Bell Hooks also spoke to this specifically around sex. when she talked about this sort of non-relational sex that men are trying to get that's out there. And she said that most men think that sex will provide them with a sense of being alive, connected, that sex will offer closeness, intimacy, and pleasure. More often than not, sex simply does not deliver the goods. This fact does not lead men to cease obsessing about sex. It intensifies their lust and their longing, right? And so what she's talking about here is non-relational sex, right? This is that, okay, only if I can have sex, if I can get some, then I'm going to feel alive, connected, close, intimate, and pleasure, right? What I'm really looking for is a relational experience. And the problem is I'm never going to get it through non-relational sex. That's what Bell Hooks is saying to us. What the guys are saying to us earlier is I buy sex because I don't want to risk intimacy or connection or rejection, right? And so what he's seeking is non-relational sex in order to meet relational needs. And you can never get there from here. And so what ends up happening is this cycle of shame, of not meeting those needs. Why am I doing this again? And then not having the skills to even understanding what's going on for themselves. And it's really tragic. It's really tragic. And it's tragic for those men who don't get to self-actualize. It's all even more tragic for the people who bear the brunt of it. Who pays the price for these guys not getting their stuff together and being able to do some healing and being able to live fully engaged lives? And that is the women in their lives around them, and women and girls and others in prostitution, right? And the prostitution gets set up also through a construct about gender. You know, for boys and men, we've got the act like a man box, but for girls and women, and the way boys learn to think about girls and women, it's through this good girl, bad girl dichotomy, right? And you can all, I'm sure, understand what that is. I'm not going to delve too deeply into it, but these ideas that we have about who a good girl is, what she does, what a bad girl is, what she does. And if you think about it, you know, a lot of them have to do, like, if I think of this stereotype of good girl, right? She's very nice, she's quiet, she dresses conservatively, she doesn't drink or do drugs, she has no sexual history, she's a virgin or at the very least monogamous, right? And if I look at the bad girl, it's the mirror opposite, right? That she's loud, that she has a lot of sex partners, she drinks, she does drugs, she dresses in really provocative sorts of ways. And just with those few descriptors, I think we can start to understand how the bad girl construct, and again, it's not about people, it's about a construct, gets used to ultimately blame people who experience exploitation and even assault, right? If you think to the victim blaming questions that get asked when we hear a woman's been sexually assaulted, what are they? Was she drinking? How was she dressed? What's her sexual history, right? We can go down the list. It's pretty much, is she a bad girl? Is she a slut or a whore? Because then she probably brought it on herself. Then she deserves what she got, right? And so it's this sort of mode of thinking about women and thinking about gender that I think really contributes to not just sex buying, but to intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. And that's not even to start talking about the violence that men do in other aspects of our lives, things like bullying, that come from this same sort of shut down place that refuses to be accountable, right? For interacting with others in a way that recognizes their humanity, their full humanity, as somebody not too so different from ourselves. A woman named Evelina Giobbi from Whisper in Minneapolis back in the 1980s was a person who really inspired me to get into a lot of this work. She has a quote that I'm sharing with you here that speaks to that good girl, bad girl dichotomy, right? And she said, prostitution isn't like anything else. Rather, everything else is like prostitution because it's the model for women's condition, right? Think of sexual harassment, think of sexual assault. The guys that come to the sex buyers class say this every cohort. They say it differently. They say it like this: if you scratch the surface, they're all whores underneath. All sex is transactional. You pay somehow. If you're not paying with your money, you're paying by getting married or by dating or by buying her dinner or by listening to her, right? This is not about mutual sexual activity between equals who really are into each other. This is about the control and subordination of somebody by another person, right? And we can see that it doesn't stop with people in prostitution. Like that it extends to this analysis that all women are, I'm able to treat all women this way, because this is ultimately their nature, right? And so this is pervasive. This is pervasive, and it's not just about a few bad apples. What we know is that most men don't buy sex. Depending on the study you look at, 10, 15, maybe up to 20% of men during their lifetime will buy sex. But it's not just about a few bad apples. It's really about structural inequality, and it's about values. And that those values and norms, right, ultimately it's about changing norms, don't end with men who buy sex. These men don't come from nowhere. They come from somewhere. And that somewhere is from our communities and our societies. And so if we're going to tackle the issue of sex buyers, we need to look at it in a real holistic way, and not just about men who buy sex, you know, because for them it's normal, right? This participant in SSE said, I bought sex because I thought it was normal. It was just something that we did sometimes. I mean, the norms to him were that men bought sex. Men are entitled to do this. And this speaks to something that I like to call hegemonic, or commonly it's called toxic masculinity, right? And this sort of masculinity that buys sex or that sexually assaults is not assumed to be normal in a statistical sense. Again, only a minority of men might enact it, but it is normative. And it's normative in that it embodies the currently most honored way of being a man and requires all men to position themselves in relation to it. And it ideologically legitimates the subordination of women to men. You know, and that's a mouthful. That's a lot there. But I think that the things to point out are that what happens is that many times with men, it's the biggest jerk. I mean, say I'm with a group of men, the biggest jerk in the room sets the norm, right? The biggest jerk in the room says something, makes a joke about sexual assault. What are the other guys in the room going to do? Well, it's my wish and my hope that we would interrupt that and say, that's not funny, and have a conversation about it and ask him why he would say such a thing. But the reality that I know from having worked with men for decades is that when you're in that situation, a lot of times even the best men among us don't say anything because they're afraid. And again, most men don't do these types of things. It's not normal in statistical sense, but it is normative in that it embodies the currently most honored, or we might say feared, way of being a man, and requires all men to deal with that. So the gauntlet has been thrown. That guy makes the rape joke. We're all questioning ourselves. What are we going to do with it? Are we going to call him out? He's a good friend of mine. He's my boss. He's my sister's or my husband, or whatever it is. But it calls us to account, right? It calls us to, who are we accountable to? Are we going to stand up and say something in this situation? Because if we don't, what it does is it ideologically legitimates the subordination of women to men. Right? So you see, in this whole circumstance, I'm not even talking about sex buying, right? But what happens is a culture gets created that is the same culture where sex buying happens. You know, it's sometimes called rape culture. It's a culture of entitlement. It's sometimes called patriarchy or male supremacy. And it's very real. And it's women who pay the price. It's women who pay the price for the man that won't interrupt the sexist joke, for the man who won't step up and say, you know, no, not in our name. And, you know, it is most of us, most of us men, most of your brothers and your male friends don't want these types of things happen. We don't like it when these types of things are said, but we just don't have the language and skills and support, or don't feel it, for speaking up to end it. And so when we're talking about engaging men, and when we're talking about ending commercial sexual exploitation, we're talking about creating a culture of respect, a culture of mutuality, and a culture of equality. And one of the ways that we need to do that is to challenge the male bond. This is not the male bond that, you know, I'm talking, where you go fishing with a friend and talk about what's going on in your life and share your deepest insecurities and whatever else you do when you're with your male friends. This is the type of male bonding that is about the subordination of women, right? That's about, I have this connection with this guy and we're all guys here and women are down there. And those male-male social bonds have a powerful influence on the sexual relations of heterosexual men, right? They're not having sex with these men that are their peers many times, but they are shaping the way they think about sex, right? And it shapes the sexual relations which they engage, the meanings given to their sexual involvements, and the developments of narratives about them. You know, and we can look at this homosociality, this all-male group organizing men's relations in at least 4 ways with one another. You know, male-male friendships take priority over male-female relationships, or in the vernacular, bros before hoes. You probably heard that before, right? And that's no accident that that's using the name of the language of prostitution, right? Again, think back to Evelina Giobi and that SSE participant who said all women are whores. You know, second, platonic friendships with women are seen as dangerously feminizing. Third, heterosexual sex itself can be the medium through which male bonding is enacted. We can look at gang rape as one practice that happens, right? But it also can happen through prostitution itself. You know, even if the men don't know each other, there's this sense of acting out sexually on a shared group of people that reinforces kind of this bond that creates the subordination of women as other. And then men's sexual storytelling. You know, those of us who grew up in locker rooms or who grew up in the boardrooms or who go to the boardrooms now really understand that sexual storytelling is shaped by homosocial masculine cultures, right? That if there's a woman in the room, suddenly the discourse changes, right? Suddenly it changes because it's broken this bond. So this way of looking at the problem of commercial sexual exploitation is relatively new, like in the grand scheme of things. You know, prostitution is pretty old, and this is a relatively new way to look at it. And it was enacted legislatively in Sweden, actually, in the late 1990s. At that point, prostitution was fully decriminalized in Sweden. So it wasn't criminal for buyers, it wasn't criminals for those who were exploited, wasn't criminals for pimps and traffickers. They went that way in the 1970s because they recognized that criminalizing prostitution was leading to a real barrier for women getting out and other people getting out of the life of prostitution. And so they fully decriminalized in the 70s. When it came into the 90s, they recognized, well, that didn't help in terms of stopping trafficking, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. They saw that women were being trafficked from Eastern Europe in order to meet the demand in Sweden. And so what they did was they took a really different look at it. They said, rather than just criminalize again, we're going to criminalize for the buyers and we're going to criminalize for the traffickers. So we're going to keep it decriminalized for people who are exploited and offer them exit programming, and that for the buyers and the traffickers, we're going to criminalize this because it is an issue of gender inequality. And having a long time commitment to gender equality, Sweden was able to make this step. And so when I was doing my work in Seattle about 10 years ago with Organization for Prostitution Survivors, we were looking at it in this way. And although we never enacted it legislatively, what we wanted to do through policies and practices and through community engagement was to provide the same analysis, right? Policies and practices rooted in the same gender equality analysis, where with exploited persons, we would do prevention work, have comprehensive survivor-led exit programming for adults as well as youth, immediate, safe, and easy access to all necessary resources and support, and real alternatives, right? All these things we want. We're aspirational. Again, I'm not saying we got all this in place when I wish that we did when I was in Seattle, but this was our map, right? And when we looked at exploiters, the buyers as well as the traffickers, what we wanted to do was prevent, disrupt, intervene, hold to account, and transform. And then recognizing that, again, these things happen within society, happen within culture, we needed to do work on community and social norms. And in order to do that, we needed to have robust prevention programming. We needed to change the norms that blame the exploited and those that support men's entitlement, right? So challenge to act like a man box and deconstruct that good girl, bad girl dichotomy. Change the norms that blame the exploited and support those that support men's and those that support men's entitlement. And then engagement across multiple sectors, right? Be able to engage across multiple sectors to be able to again, shift those norms at the root of the practice. And so if you want to check out some of the work that's still happening in King County and City of Seattle, you can go to www.endingexploitation.com. And they're doing great work. They're actually scaling statewide in Washington state now. And when I left Seattle a couple of years ago, I was funded to do this work on engaging communities around the country in adopting the equality model in policy and practice, right? Modeling equality. So this is just some of the partners in Seattle that I worked with. I was the co-founder of Organization for Prostitution Survivors with Noel Gomez. And we also worked with these other, the State Attorney General's office, the prosecuting attorneys, the City of Seattle, and other nonprofit organizations in order to really bring the community together with this shared analysis of what the problem was. And again, this was unique. I was invited several years ago to be on a panel at the Carter Center in Atlanta. And I was invited to be on a panel with all of these other folks from around the world that had actually enacted the equality model legislatively, right? So there were people from France and Ireland, and a woman from Ireland got up and said, we've got the Nordic model, the equality model legislatively, we don't know how to do it, how to implement it though. And the person from France said the same thing. It was my turn. I was able to say, we don't have it legislatively in King County or Washington State, but we're learning to do it on the ground. We're learning how to operationalize it. And so I think that's what I'm sharing with you today is like, legislation would be great at some point to institutionalize equality model, Nordic model legislation, but more important is the analysis. And more important is the way that we develop policies and practices that deal with what the problem really is, which is one of gender inequality. And then that can inform what we do. It informs what we do with buyers, right? And direct interventions with commercial sex buyers and potential buyers need to happen along a spectrum of prevention and intervention. People often look at me and see, oh, this is the guy that does the 10-week sex buyers class, and say, oh, he thinks that the answer to stopping commercial sexual exploitation is to get these guys after they buy sex and arrest them and put them in a class. And I would say that is probably the worst way that you can stop commercial sexual exploitation. It's important work to do in that it's part of a coordinated response. But if it's really about changing the culture, it needs to happen along the lifespan. We need to be engaged in primary prevention, and that would be things like parenting boys, teaching folks who mentor, like good big brothers, big sisters, about gender-based violence and about the way that we pass on these ways of thinking to young people. We need to be teaching empathy and respect to children. There's a great program in San Diego that works with fourth grade boys. And it's all about social emotional learning, right? This is giving them the skills to be able to deal with the difficulties in their lives and to be able to be resilient and to have a full range of emotions. The middle school and high school prevention curricula are really important. And a lot of times when I hear about groups that are working doing anti-trafficking prevention, it's sad because they'll tell me about how great it is that they're going into high schools and talking to young women about how not to get trafficked. And to me, that's often, that reminds me of how it was when I got started doing my work on sexual assault. Back in the 80s, we were just coming out of the era when anti-rape education or sexual assault prevention was about giving out rape whistles to the girls in the class. And saying, if you're assaulted, you blow this and maybe somebody will help you. We started to see while we're there, maybe it would be good to have a conversation with the boys about mutuality, about consent, about healthy relationships, And so I think that integrating the issue of sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation into existing violence prevention curricula in middle schools and high schools that are dealing with dating violence and sexual assault and sexual harassment is key. That's really key, because these things are often siloed off and then misunderstood as something other than what they are. And it would be a shame to see us make all the same mistakes that were made when we've got such great folks to learn from in sexual assault and intimate partner violence prevention work. We can do a lot in terms of awareness, promoting men's accountability, building the culture, co-creating a culture based on respect and mutuality. I don't have time to share them with you today, but there's a lot of nifty online tricks that I've been talking to Veronica's voice about how to engage men through online interventions and chatbots and targeted advertising and outreach. And so again, there's lots to do there, and happy to jump on another time with y'all, and if that's something you're interested in exploring, because it is pretty fascinating stuff. And then finally, there's the arrest, the prosecution, and the conviction. And that's an important part of things. But when I'm talking to folks around the country, I say, don't put all your eggs in that basket. Like, don't think, okay, there's a problem with demand for commercial sex, so we're going to just target the buyers. While that's an important part of it, and while it should inform the other work that's happening, in and of itself, it's not an adequate intervention. And then, of course, there's the post-conviction intervention programs, but it's not a few bad apples, again. And it's not just the individuals that we need to engage, right? It's not just boys and men and individuals out there who might engage in this behavior. We need to change everything around them. We need to change the world around them. So while commercial sexual exploitation is an individual problem, it's also a social problem. Right? It's a big problem. It's a big problem for all of society. And when I'm thinking about being located in society and how to change society, it can be pretty overwhelming, because who am I? I'm this little person. It's this big world. How can I change commercial sexual exploitation? But luckily, sociologists and others have given us some tools to be able to look at how we create societal change coming from an individual place. And one of these tools is the social ecological model. And what we know is that social ecological models bridge that gap. They bridge the gap between behavioral theories that focus on individuals and theories that focus on cultural and social norms change, right? So this is, while we're engaged in that individual work along the spectrum of prevention with that potential buyer, we're also engaged in this broader project of changing social norms. And I like to use this little map. I use it with people in prostitution that I've worked with historically. I use it with sex buyers in order to kind of locate yourself within your personal social ecology, and then figure out how to make change in your life and change in our world. So if we think of the individual, we're not just in society, but we're in relationships. And so it can be helpful to think who we have relationships with, right? Our family members, our friends, the people in our neighborhood, our social groups. All of these places are places where we can have conversations that change the culture around commercial sexual exploitation and around other forms of gender-based violence and inequality, right? And having the courage to have those conversations is great, and we can really change the culture, right? Here's a quick story about that. I was talking to a group of sex buyers in one of my class. I introduced this social ecological model to them the last night of class together, and I say to them, I'm glad you're never going to buy sex anymore. Thrilled that this class was effective in that way, but it's not enough. We need you to engage with others to be able to stop commercial sexual exploitation. And so think about this, think about who you're in relationship with. So anyway, my story. A couple weeks after this particular cohort, this guy calls me on the phone who had been in the class. And I really didn't think he had gotten much out of the class, but he says to me, Peter, I just want to let you know that this class has changed my life, and it's changed the way I practice medicine. I'm thinking, change the way you practice medicine? How could curious about that? I was especially curious because he's a pediatrician, right? how could this class have changed the way you practice medicine? And he says, well, now whenever I have one of my young male patients come in, I have a conversation with him about consent, about respecting other people, and about toxic masculinity. And I thought, how great is that? That this person who, you know, several months earlier was arrested for buying sex, now is able to engage this young person and in a conversation about healthy relationships and healthy forms of identification. Like, to me, that was just like spoke volumes about the class. But I think it also speaks to our power as individuals within those that we're in relationships with. And we're not just in relationships with individuals, we're parts of communities, right? One thing that the sex buyers used to do when I talked to this about them is they used to invite me into their communities to do presentations. You know, maybe that community didn't know that they'd been in this class, but they wanted somebody to come and talk to their community about gender-based violence or intimate partner violence or whatever it was. So it could have been their faith-based community, their work community. There were lots of different engagements that happened because of that. And then of course there's institutions, right? That they're all members of institutions. So on a policy and practical and practices level, there's those institutional changes that can happen. And so we really use this social ecological model as this map where how do we engage others in order to make this change. And I'm gonna, I know that I wanted to have at least 15 minutes or so to open it up and have some conversations, but I just wanna make this even more confusing for you because I know that the social ecological model is a lot, but if you're able to go just a little further with me, I think that this for me is like, if we can, the way we conceptualize this is break it down a little bit further. And this is what we did in Seattle, is we can target specific sectors, right? If we can think in our communities about what are the sectors, and these, you know, they don't have to match up with these, but I think a lot of times we just look to criminal justice and government, right? That if we can change the law, if we can get the police to law enforcement to arrest these particular individuals, that we'll be able to make the change. And I think that that is it's very limiting in terms of how we can make change in our communities. You know, think about the health, medical, mental health, public health folks, and not just in terms of the way that they interface with victims or survivors. But, you know, I used to get a whole lot of nurses and doctors come to my class as sex buyers. And they used to tell me that they'd had the training on trafficking recognition, and there had never been a word spoken to them about sex buying as a practice of gender-based inequality, or about it being a harmful practice in and of itself. You know, but they understood once we were able to engage them. You know, businesses, we were able to do a lot of really great work in Seattle through with businesses ending sex trafficking, best there. On not just on the, again, not just on the victim survivor side of things, exploited person side, but on the demand for commercial sex. And again, you know, the education sector, other community partners, technology, there's all of these ways that we can change the norms that are at the root of this practice and change our culture so that it's one that we could, that's worth sharing. And so with that, I'd like to maybe open it up for conversation, questions, answers, concerns. If I could stop sharing with you all.
We have two questions in the chat. One is, what are the big successes that we should be modeling? And the other is links to prevention education for young men.
Okay. So there have been small successes. I think that there's people that are out there that are getting it right. I don't think anybody's cracked the code yet in terms of changing the culture. There's no really safe place for everybody to go right now. But I think that King County and Seattle has done a good job. I think that, and so that Ending Exploitation website is good. But they're still building out the model, right? They were still trying to figure out how we do this work. So I think that for me, the prevention programming, if we're looking at the sort of middle school, high school work, there's a group in Chicago called CASE, which is Chicago Allied Against Sexual Exploitation, that has a great prevention program that's actually targeted towards young men. There's trafficking prevention program in schools that's modeled after CASE, is the one they use in Seattle. Also great. Tanya's the director there and does a great job with it, with that program. And I can, you can find links to those, or I could send them out to y'all. But I think in general, this isn't a cookie cutter sort of approach. That I think that each different community needs to be able to look at what pieces they've got in place and identify kind of who's willing to do the work, who understands kind of what the work is, and then is like convenes people together to be able to figure out how to work through this together. It's a social change project, unfortunately. People often contact me and say like, aren't you the guy that does the Long John School? Our city is interested in the Long John School. And so like, can we just do that? And the answer is, I'm happy to, share and help you to do the Long John School. The Stopping Sexual Exploitation program is the preferred name that I use. But that's, that's just a piece of it, right? And so I think thinking about it, and this is again, learning from intimate partner violence, learn from domestic violence. What did we learn about coordinated community responses? What did we learn about how we need to expand beyond just social service and law enforcement? We learned that these need to be embedded in the communities. We learned that we need to learn to work across multiple levels of social ecology and along a spectrum of prevention to make these changes. And so, so yes, the work is broad. There's no particular model that you can look to, but I think that the principles are out there. And part of what I'm funded to do is work with cities to be able to create responses in their communities around a shared analysis of gender equality. And so, so hopefully I'll be able to, a year from now, point to your community and say, who's doing it really well? Well, let me tell you, there are a whole bunch of folks in Kansas City that are doing it well.
And y'all are welcome to unmute and ask questions too. I'm just reading what's in the chat. How did you initially get the courts to start referring men to your class? And were there other providers who were also providing the same type of class?
Yeah, that's right. This is one of the most important things, is how do you get the courts to do. So my first class I started in 1995 in Portland, Oregon. And at that point, the law enforcement had just been arresting. I was working with an organization that was providing exit for survivors. And we were advocating that because they weren't arresting buyers at all back in the early 90s. That we were advocating that they start arresting buyers, and then they did. And since I was doing domestic violence intervention programming at that time, I thought, well, what about creating an intervention program for sex buyers? And so unfortunately, I would have liked to have created a long-term program, because it was a misdemeanor crime that they were basically fining $100 a time. At that time, the best I could do was a 3-day weekend workshop, right? That we did a 3-day weekend workshop with the sex buyers. And basically the way I got the judges to send men to the class was just pitching it to them and just saying, this is the idea. And luckily they did. And then we were able to get some data and show that it was working, and we did the pilot and then grew it from there. Fast forward 25 years, I've done a lot of different types of sex buyers intervention. I got some funding to create a new model that was 10 weeks long, because most of the models are 1 day, like a 1 day class. And again, I'm available to talk a lot more about John Schools and sex buyers programs at another time too. But so part of where we succeeded there was building relationships within the prosecuting attorney's office and being able to have them partner with us and actually be able to go around to all the municipalities in King County and saying, prosecutor, the attorney is recommending this particular program as a post-conviction consequence for sex buyers. And and as a restorative justice, transformative justice program. And so having that buy-in is key. Having that partnership is key. And then again, you measure it and you show that it works, and then you're able to go back to all those partners again and again and again and say, okay, here's the first 2 cohorts, here's the first year, this is how it's looking so far. And being able to pull the quotes from the class and talk to them, because we're trying to change those institutions and communities as well. I think somebody asked in the chat box, the police have historically themselves been purchasers, some. So what do you do there? Well, judges have been historically purchasers too. One of the worst participants I ever had in terms of his difficulty in a class was a federal prosecutor back in '96. Got arrested as a sex buyer and got sent to the class. And he was like one of the most misogynist men I've ever met in my life. And that's saying a lot coming from somebody who's worked with so many sex buyers. So I think that we can't pretend that that there's these kind of institutions that are fair and just, and that where these things don't happen, right? That wherever we are, there's some sort of percentage of men who engage in these types of behaviors. And so we need to change the cultures within those institutions as well. And so seeing that, which is part of the reason whenever I go anywhere and I do a presentation about commercial sexual exploitation, I go through a lot of the basic stuff and the basic analysis about what the problem is, because it shows us where to look in terms of how we make change and in terms of what needs to change. So go ahead.
Kind of piggyback off my question there, because I feel like I'm kind of stuck in one of these. I'm the director for the Missouri Attorney General's Task Force.
Okay.
And I feel like I'm stuck in one of those chicken or the egg type of things,
Yep.
with your program. So I mean, your program is post-conviction, but how? I mean, if you're in a situation where there's no convictions, how do you?
Right. Well,
how do you overcome that?
So, and this is, I mean, I wish I had like a concrete answer. What I've got is like, some places are doing this more as a diversion program, right? Where this is something that is done that is not post-conviction, but that if they do it, then there's no record of a conviction at all. And that's one way to do it. I thought, and we talked about doing that in King County too. And there are reasons for wanting to do things that way. I thought, why cut short? Like, we know that this personally, I think that the more consequences, the better. And that having it post-conviction is saying something. It's saying that this is something that we need to look at that's serious. Again, that's not the hill that I would die on. And I think that if there was a lot of resistance, I would consider, other deferred sentencing or a diversion or whatever. There's a lot of different ways that this could be done. But I would also caution that a lot of times I hear from people, well, our city really wants to do this, but we want to do it in 2 days. Like, we want to do a 2-day class. And so is there a way that we can do this program in 2 days? And for me, it's once again, if that's the pushback that you're getting, then the work that you need to do is change the culture within the institutions that are pushing back and saying no. And unfortunately, that's a lot harder to do because you can't mandate them to a 10-week class about how to learn this. Maybe that would be worth trying. Would be like, maybe we could do a version of SSE for statewide in Missouri for folks. Because I think that there's a lot of value in it. I think that there's a lot of that we can all learn from it. I've been doing a lot more work with volunteers and with others who haven't bought sex, using a lot of the same stuff that we do in SSE as kind of ways to train them to go out and do the work too. So yeah, I know that's a real long-winded way of not answering your question, and I don't have a specific thing worked out, but I'm happy to have more conversations about it and to brainstorm. If you ever want to brainstorm, just reach out. It's kind of my job to give technical assistance and consult on these issues. So I'm happy to have a conversation offline.
I would love that. That would be great.
Yeah.
Maybe Lucy could set that up. So,
Yeah, and for any of you, you know, I'll say no if I don't have time. I don't have infinite time for for everybody, but I'm always happy to talk with folks who are interested in this. And unfortunately, there's not a lot out there, so I do have more time than I probably should, giving free training and technical assistance on how to stop commercial sexual exploitation. But do email me at peter@modelingequality.org. And I'm glad to have conversations if this has provoked some more questions for you.
okay, thank you.
Is anybody else? I think we've got 5 minutes left. Is there anybody?
Just jump in or put it in the chat or whatever you're comfortable doing. We still got a little bit of time.
I see a question in the chat that I didn't get to before. It says Canada has a version of the Nordic model, but the police have to enforce it, and that's been a problem. And again, this is what I was speaking to a little bit earlier with Canada, with France and Ireland, is they all have versions of this law, this legislation, but they're having a lot of trouble implementing it. And that's in a large part because it's coming from the top down. Right, that they've convinced these legislators and they've convinced these policymakers that this is the way to go. And the people on the ground that are actually doing the work haven't changed the way they view the problem. And so that's one of the challenges, right? And that's happened in Canada, that has somewhat a version of the Nordic or equality model. And it's happened in other places as well. And so this is one of the reasons why I think we need to do the work from the ground up, and why my project is focused not on legislation, but on policies and practices. It's basically, how can, what we did in King County was that. The problem then though, is that like, you need to institutionalize it. So what my suggestion is that we get as many places adopting these policies and practices, measure the heck out of it to show that it's effective, right? Talk about what effectiveness means, and then be able to make the case for the legislation that institutionalize it more broadly. So that would be my way of kind of saying we need to work from both ends, like the ground up and the top down, and meet in the middle and change it all.
That's cool. Okay, any additional questions? 3 minutes we have left. Or Peter or Lucy, either one. Do you guys have any concluding thoughts before we wrap up?
I just want to say thank you. I know that there's a lot of kind of things that you can do with your time, and that this hasn't always been an issue that a lot of people are drawn to. So when you see an announcement for a webinar on engaging men or promoting men's accountability to stop gender-based violence or commercial sexual exploitation, it's great to see how many people hopped on. And I wish, one of the things always though is like, I wish we'd have seen a lot more men sign up. And that's always the way it is. Like that you go into a community, you're like, I'm going to do a workshop on engaging men to stop sexual assault or whatever. And then 10 people sign up and 8 of them are women. And they're there because they want to see who the heck are these guys that are interested in stopping sexual assault? Who are these guys that care? And I think that that's where we're going to really need to be able to do this work, is to really be able to engage that part of men that really does deeply care. And whenever I talk to women in my life, they talk about they've got this brother or this cousin or somebody that really does walk his talk in terms of the way that he treats others. And so I feel like we need to engage with those guys and elevate their voices so that we're able to change the culture. So thanks. I just want to thank you all for participating and signing on. And again, encourage you to keep on keeping on this issue, because we need all the help we can get.
And thanks to everybody for joining us. Again, you have my contact information and Peter's. anything that we can do, any questions or comments or suggestions or ideas for us, please let us know. And thanks for everything that you all do in your communities and also in our community here. And thanks for joining us. Hope you guys have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much for being here today. Yeah, okay.